So up to Mark 1:20, we saw Jesus calling his first disciples, Peter and Andrew, James and John, and as soon as he called them, these first four disciples decided to leave everything, to leave their boat, to leave their fishing business, to leave their father Zebedee, and following Jesus right away. Now, in Mark 1:21, we're going to see Jesus starting his public ministry in the synagogues. Now, if you read the other synoptic gospels, in particular Matthew and Luke, you're going to see that what Mark narrates here in Mark 1:21 is not the first time that occurs. And so we're going to see and discover today that the chronology of Mark is a little off with respect to Matthew and Luke. And we're going to try to reconcile this. So make sure to stick around until the end of the video so you can get a full picture of what the true chronology of the events is. Let's start reading Mark 1:21. Kai esporeuonta eis Capernaum. Kai uthus toi Sabbasin eis elzon esten synagogen et idesken. Let's try to understand the structure of this sentence. First of all, there are two sentences here. The first one is very simple, starts with a kai, and then there is the verb, esporeuonta, and then there is the place where they are moving to. All right, place. The second sentence again starts with this kai euthus, which is a formula that we've seen so many times now in Mark, and usually translated as and immediately afterwards and straight away. This toi sabbasin indicates a time, a temporal indication of when the action is taking place. Then there is this ezel son, which is a participle referring to Jesus. And we're going to spend some time on understanding why it's put in brackets. And then there is again this eis ten synagogen, the same formula, eis, which we know again indicates a movement to or into a place. And then at the end, you have the very verb, which is the main verb of the second sentence. So from a grammatical point of view, there's no difficulty here. Now, starting from the beginning, kai is a conjunction, means and. And then there's the verb, esporeuontai. Now, let's try to break it down because it's a very long word. Well, you see this eis in front, which, by the way, appears here, and appears here. So this preposition eis appears 4 times in this verse of Mark. So it's pretty important. And what does this preposition mean? We know it because we've seen it many times. It means into. Okay, entering into a place. All right. So the base verb comes from poreuontai, okay, which, by the way, is a present, indicative present in the third person plural. Okay, and we know that because you have this ending in ontai. Okay, this ending is the third person plural of a middle verb. Okay, and the verb is poreuomai. And what does poreuomai mean? Poreuomai means to go. Okay, and so what does eis poreuomai mean? Means to go into or to enter. We've seen in the past another verb that it's commonly used to indicate this idea of going into, to enter, which is eiserkomai, which we better keep in mind because it's going to pop up many times in Mark, eiserkomai, which is a synonym of esporeuomai. It has the same meaning, to enter. All right. So it's very interesting the fact that Mark here moves from the past to the present. Esporeuontai is a present indicative, so present tense. Mark loves to use what's called the historical present, meaning you're telling a story that, of course, happened in the past, but you're using the present tense. Why do you do that? To make it more vivid, to make it more alive. If you tell something in the present tense, the reader or whoever listens to you imagines that the action is happening right there at that moment when you hear the story. So that's a rhetorical trick to make your story more interesting for the reader. So, and they enter. Who is this they? Of course, it's Jesus, is Andrew and Peter, James and John, but could be all the other disciples that still at the time were following Jesus. But definitely the five of them for sure are the ones that are moving into a place. So where are they going? They are going eis Capernaum, into, and as we know, the preposition eis wants the accusative case. All right. And in this particular case, they're entering a place with a proper name. And in fact, you see this capitalized K or kappa. So it's a place, it's the name of the place. And you probably already realize what this is Capernaum, all right? In Greek, Capharnaum. Let's spend some time on this because we know that the names of all these places and these proper names that of course are not Greek names, are Greek transliteration of Hebrew names, they all have a Hebrew root behind. And the beauty of Hebrew is that every single proper name usually has a meaning behind it. Capharnaum comes from two Hebrew words, kafar and Nahum. Kafar means village, and Nahum, well, Nahum comes from the verb Naham. Let's spend some time here because the verb Naham in Hebrew is very interesting. It has a spectrum of meanings. It can mean to be sorry, it can mean to regret, it can mean to repent, and it can also mean to console or to comfort or be comforted. So there's a spectrum of meaning, but they're all somehow linked to each other. It starts from a grievance. You grieve, you feel some psychological pain. All right. So you are sorry about something that happened. And so you have this feeling of grieving, and this produces a feeling of regretting. You're regretting about something that either happened to you or that you did, okay, that you should not have done. And so this regretting turns sometimes into a repentance. And so this painful process of realizing that something bad happened to you or you did something bad, and so that you're repenting about, puts you in that condition of consoling yourself and to be comforted. Think about the idea of crying, of mourning. Well, the whole idea of mourning, of crying, is a physical reaction to cope with the psychological pain, right? So it's a mechanism that the body puts in place to comfort yourself. And in fact, once you're done crying after a very emotional moment, well, you usually feel better, right? Because you have consoled yourself, you have comforted yourself through that process of crying, of mourning, of grieving. Naham is a verb that contains a spectrum of all these feelings inside. And if you think about it, it's so fitting that Jesus decides to make Capharnaum the center of his public ministry. He decides to move there from Nazareth and move his residence there in Capernaum on the coast of the Sea of Galilee, because Capernaum literally means the village of comfort. And that's how usually it's translated. Capernaum means the village of comfort. But if you don't know what's behind this idea of comfort, you're really missing the point. This comfort, this consolation comes only after this process of grieving. Remember what Jesus says: come to me, you who mourn, and I will give you rest, I will give you comfort. Well, all this process of abandoning yourself to Jesus and giving him our distress so that we can get rest and comfort, they're all inside the name of Capharnaum, the village of comfort. And it's a comfort that comes from compassion, from mercy. The verb naham is the same verb that is used to describe God's feeling after he sent the universal flood. God sees the destruction that occurred over the earth, and he naham. He feels sorry about humanity. He feels sorry about the devastation of the flood. And he promises himself never to send such a big chastisement on the world ever again. Here you have it on the map. Look, this is Nazareth right here on the bottom of Galilee, and here you have Capernaum. You see, it's right here on the shore of the Lake of Galilee, northeast of Nazareth. Now, that's where very likely he found Peter and Andrew, James and John. And here's where the chronology of Mark is a little off. Let's see why. Well, we know that at the beginning of the story, Jesus comes from Nazareth down to Bethany to get baptized by John the Baptist. And then after John the Baptist gets arrested, he decides to move away from that region because it became too dangerous, and he decides to go back to Galilee. Now, if you read Matthew, if you read Luke, we know that Jesus doesn't go back to Capernaum. He goes back to his own home place, which is Nazareth. And that's, of course, the most obvious thing for Jesus to do. He came from Nazareth, he comes back from Nazareth. Then what happens? Why is he moving from Nazareth to Capernaum? Well, if you read Mark or if you read even Matthew, you really don't understand that. In Mark, you don't even know that Jesus come back to Nazareth. You just have that Jesus just was in Galilee. He was walking on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, found Peter, Andrew, James, and John, and then he just entered the synagogue of Capernaum. If you read Matthew, you have a little bit more information because it says that Matthew chapter 4, before going to Capernaum, Matthew says that he went back to Nazareth. But it doesn't give any explanation because soon after he says he moved from Nazareth to Capernaum. And again, the question remains, why is Jesus moving away from his hometown? I mean, at the end of the day, Nazareth and Capernaum were just, very close to each other. What's the problem? Why didn't he stay in his own hometown? Well, we need to read Luke chapter 4 to understand that. And if you remember, it's a very famous passage. Jesus goes to Nazareth and he hopes that he's going to start preaching there to his own people, the people that he knows, people that probably are friends with him. But you know what happened? He went to the synagogues there and they rejected him. They wanted to kill him. He revealed basically that he was the Messiah and they were not ready. And that's when Jesus said, there's no prophet in his hometown. And so that's the reason. And now we understand why Jesus decides to move away from Nazareth and make Capernaum the headquarter of his own public ministry. And that's where probably he found Peter, Andrew, James, and John. And in fact, if you read Matthew, if you read Luke, they give what is the most reasonable chronology of the events. Luke and Matthew give this episode that Mark is narrating here in the verse that we're looking at today, occurring before the call of Peter, Andrew, James, and John, which makes much more sense because Jesus first went to the synagogues in Capernaum and he started preaching there. And then while he was in Capernaum, probably he was strolling along the Sea of Galilee with his disciples. And that's when he finally found Peter, John, James, and Andrew. So now that we have clarified the exact chronology of the events, let's see what the second part of the verse in Mark 1:21 says. Kai eutsus, we already commented on this, means and straight away. It's peculiar to Mark. He uses this expression all the time. He loves this expression. And right away. Now, tois sabazin. If you see this Omicron, Iota, Sigma, That's an indication of a dative case. In particular, a plural, okay? And in this case, it's neuter because the term Sabbaton is neuter. Now, toys is a definite article, means the, okay? But why the dative case? Well, it's one of the many ways that the Greek has to define a temporal indication. So if you put a term into the dative, it can give a temporal indication. So sabazin, it's a plural neuter in the dative case because of course the article and the noun they have to agree with each other, and this term is a term that everybody knows is the sabbaton, which means Sabbath, okay, is the famous Jewish Sabbath, which is the whole Jewish holy day of the week. Is the day, the seventh day, where God rested after the creation. So it's holy, and it's also in the commandment, keep the Sabbath holy. All right. Now, the question comes here in why Mark uses the plural. Okay. So it doesn't say the Sabbath, it says the Sabbaths, literally. Now, there's a lot of debate among scholars on the meaning of the plural. Now, there are a lot of other passages in Mark, in the same Gospel of Mark, where the plural of Sabbath is used to indicate just one particular Sabbath. So this could be one of those cases. But there is a problem here with this interpretation, and it's found in the verb that we're going to analyze soon, which is a didascan. You see this epsilon in front? That indicates that the verb, the main verb of the sentence, is in the imperfect tense. And we know, as in English, that the imperfect tense indicates an action that is continuing in time. So he was doing something continuously, toi Sabbathing, the Sabbaths, all the Sabbaths, every single Sabbath was he was doing the same thing. So I think that since the verb is in the imperfect tense, I believe and tend to believe that the correct interpretation of this is more the really the plural meaning, more than one specific Sabbath. What Mark is telling us here is that Jesus, right away after moving to Capernaum, he's starting doing this, and we're going to see what this is, every single Sabbath. And what was he doing every single Sabbath? He a didascan. So we already said that a didascan is the imperfect tense of a verb that is didasko. Now, this verb is very important because it means to teach. All right, to teach. Now, didasco has some roots also in English. There are some words in English, like, for example, didactic. Okay, if something is didactic, it has to do with the process of learning, teaching, and learning. So after they moved to Capernaum, Jesus starts doing something. Every single Sabbath, he starts teaching. And where is he teaching exactly? Well, the last piece of the verse is telling us exactly that. Now, let's spend some time on this word in brackets here. Is Azel son, okay? Azel son is a participle in the aorist tense, okay? And particularly is the masculine singular in the nominative case. So it refers to Jesus. So you see the switching from the plural to the singular. They eisporeonte, they all go to Capernaum, but the one who is teaching, of course, is Jesus. All right. And eizelson is a participle, aorist referring to Jesus, coming from the verb, well, eizerchomai, the one that we talked about a little earlier, which is a synonym of eisporeuomai, which means to enter. All right, so in this verse of Mark, we find both verbs, eisporeomai and eiserkomai. Eisporeontai is in the present tense, but eiselson, sorry, is in the aorist tense. Now, why is it in brackets? Well, simply because some codices do not have this word, some others do. Now, is this verb necessary for the sentence? Well, for the understanding of the sentence is not necessary, but from a grammatical point of view, it makes more sense that Ezelson is there. Why? Because the place where he was teaching is introduced by the preposition eis, which we know means into and indicates a movement into a place. But the verb to teach is not a verb that indicates a movement. When you're teaching, you're standing somewhere. So if the meaning of this sentence was, and he was teaching in the synagogue, Mark would have never used the preposition eis, which indicates a movement. He would probably use en, which indicates a position in place. So it makes, from a grammatical point of view, more sense. There is this eselson understood, where it means and going every single Saturday, going a stain synagogen, it did the scan. So going every single Saturday to the synagogue, he was teaching there. Understood. All right. So we see that the same structure is respected. Eis porevomai eis Capernaum. They move into Capernaum, and then Jesus is el son moving eis into what? Well, into the synagogue. We know that. And in fact, 10 is the definite article, the, and synagogen is the noun, and both are in the accusative case, feminine, singular. So this ending etanu tells us that this article and this noun are in the accusative case, feminine, singular. Why in the accusative? Well, because eis, we know the preposition eis wants the accusative case. That's how Greek works. So from the beginning, and they enter into Capernaum, and right away, going to the synagogue every Sabbath, he was teaching. Now, synagogen is a very interesting term, is the synagogue. And nowadays we use that term to indicate that place where the Jews go to pray and celebrate the Sabbath, right? So synagogen comes from two Greek words. One is syn, which indicates together, okay, or with, together, okay? And the other part is the verb ago, okay? The verb ago, which means to lead, okay? To lead. Now, synagogen is so the place where you lead, where you bring people together. So literally, a synagogue is an assembly of people. Whenever people come together, well, that's a synagogue. All right, so that's the meaning of synagogues. Every single Sabbath, Jews were required, according to the law, according to the Torah, to get to their synagogue, and there were at least one synagogue per village, and there they were preaching, they were reading scriptures, and they were taught about scriptures. And so Jesus, Mark says, is doing exactly what he's expected to do. Every single Sabbath, he is going, according to the Torah, according to the law, to the synagogue, to the local synagogue. But pay attention, he was not just going there to listen, he was there, going there to teach. Under which authority was he doing that? Well, Jesus is establishing himself as a legitimate Jewish rabbi. He was performing all the duties of a Jewish rabbi. And that's how his disciples understands him, as a Jewish rabbi. We talked about the fact that it was a great honor for a poor person, for a fisherman, to be called to become a disciple of a rabbi. And that explains why Peter and Andrew, James and John just run to Jesus when he calls them, and they leave everything behind because they were honored to follow the rabbi, to follow Jesus. What were the duties of a Jewish rabbi? Well, one of the duties was teaching in synagogues. He was the one who would enter the synagogues and read scriptures and interpret scripture and explain scriptures. Remember, at that time, most of the people were illiterate. They could not read or write. Remember, Jesus came not to abolish the law, the Torah, but to fulfill the Torah. So he was Jewish, 100% Jewish, and he was following the tradition of the Jews. He was going to every single Jewish festival, and he was performing the duties that were expected from a Jewish rabbi. In fact, rabbi comes from the Hebrew term rabbi, and rabbi comes from the adjective rav, which means great. So literally, rabbi means my great one. That was the title that the disciples called their teacher, my great one. That was the type of relationship between rabbi's teacher and his disciples. Rabbi is the title that Mary Magdalene uses when she sees the resurrected Christ. She calls him rabbi. That's a honorific title. So the title rabbi is usually transliterated in Greek literally as rabbi or as didaskalos, which means teacher, because the two concepts overlapped. And here we find the verb edidasken, which is connected, of course, to the noun didaskalos, teacher. So that idea of teaching in synagogues is implying that Jesus was performing the duties of a Jewish rabbi. Now, one last word on the chronology of the events. Mark says that first Jesus called Peter and Andrew, James and John, and after he moved to Capernaum and he started teaching there in their synagogues. But if we read Matthew and if we read Luke especially, we know that before moving to Capernaum, he moved first to Nazareth. And from Luke, we know that he started teaching there in Nazareth, in the synagogues of Nazareth, and he was rejected. That's the reason why he moved to Capernaum, and then he started teaching there. And while being there, he found Peter, Andrew, James, and John while strolling around the shore of the Sea of Galilee. Now, how can we reconcile this chronology that seems to be different if we look at Mark versus Matthew and Luke? Well, we already stated at the very beginning of this series of lectures that Mark gospel is not based on a strict chronological order. We know that. Why? Because Mark was the interpreter of Peter. And so he was not an eyewitness. So he wrote in his gospel everything that he learned from Peter. And again, we already stressed this fact. When Peter was preaching, probably he was telling about the story of Jesus, about all the events that happened, but not necessarily in a chronological order. And so he tried to do his best to put all these pieces together in the most reasonable way. But of course, he was missing information that Matthew and Luke fill in. And that's the beauty of the synoptic gospels. What you don't really get from one gospel, you can understand if you compare that with the other gospel, and you finally found an harmonized picture of the exact chronology of the events. So no need to get too excited about this. If you want to search for chronology accuracy, probably Mark is not the right gospel you should look at, but still that doesn't mean that Mark is not a reliable evangelist. Actually, he is the first one who ever wrote a gospel, and he gets his material right from the mouth of Saint Peter.